Good morning, everybody. Somebody said start, and then somebody said we're early. It's 5 minutes to go. But I think now we've started, we'll carry on. I'm Leslie Southgate. I'm president of the European Board of Medical Assessors. And the first thing to emphasize is it's a very quick introduction from me just to say welcome to the conference. It's really important that you get a lot out of being here and that you enjoy yourselves and really find it a worthwhile thing to have done. And you'll notice we're working from EBMA along with ASME, Plymouth University, University of Exeter, the medical school, and the Academy of Medical Educators. And there's a lot more about everybody in the programme. That's the sort of stuff you'll see in the programme. I'm not going to read it all out to you, but it starts to give you the information about the European Board of Medical Examiners. And we were the group that really have instigated this conference and then have joined as many other people in with us. And now it's a real group working together to, I hope, give you a good time. Just a few points that we're really also interested in assessment for learning and giving feedback. So there's some quite new ideas will come up over the days of the conference, and I hope you'll enjoy hearing them or presenting your own ideas. That sums up EBMA, and you'll find again much more about that in your programs. But assessment for learning, looking at assessments, looking at supporting individuals and institutions, and trying to think about a European framework for quality assurance in healthcare. And shouldn't be at the bottom of the list, should it, but patient safety. Now, who are you? We don't know who you all are. We know who some of you are. All we know is that you've bothered to come and that we know that you're going to be great, take a good part of it. And we're welcoming participants from all around the world. We called ourselves European because it started out to be a challenge to even spread around Europe. Now we have 14 schools that work together in EBMA. Now we would like to spread out further. And so while you're here, because you come from all around the world, as you'll see in a minute, please get to know each other and consider yourselves introduced. There's nothing more lonely than being at a conference by yourself where you don't know anybody. And I'd be really disappointed if anyone goes away feeling like that afterwards. So that's where you're all from. I haven't got time to ask you to put your hands up, depending on which country suits you. Australia, Austria, Bahrain, Belgium, Cyprus, Dominica, Finland, Georgia, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Oman, Poland, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, UAE, USA, and United Kingdom.
Les, can you add in Kosovo?
Oh, I've just had to add in Kosovo because Val tells me to, and she's quite right. And we've highlighted it on the map for you as well. So, you know, if you're the only person from your country, make sure you make yourself well known to others. I'm afraid we can't do anything about the fact that the thing is in English, but perhaps another time we'll try. And so thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to hand over now to Tom Gale, who's going to chair the rest of the day, and the speakers.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Workshops are in breakout rooms, most of them on this floor.
Try that. Hello? Right, that's better, thank you. So basically, just to remind everyone that when you've got your workshops on the back of your badge, and please remind yourselves which workshop you're going to after the break this morning. For those of you who are doing presentations, please can you make sure you upload your presentations 15 minutes beforehand. So then, and I mean those sessions can start promptly after the break. Then lunch will be at 1:15. Lunch is in 3 different venues, but please, if you have any dietary requirements, you're supposed to pick up your labelled dishes from the restaurant. It's more of a buffet type of lunch affair rather than sit-down lunch, so please find anywhere you like to eat it and network with everyone else in the conference. There are no fire alarms scheduled for today, so if you do hear a fire alarm, please exit and over there. Can't do this one-handed, unfortunately. And the other thing to say is we're lucky we've got a fantastic session today. It also goes on into the evening. We've got Case van der Voeten talking in the forum, so we've got a change of venue at 5 o'clock. And for that, we have some buses arranged. Please can you make sure you get to the buses outside of the hotel entrance at 5 o'clock promptly. And can we also make sure that if for those delegates who are presenting posters, can those people get on the first bus, because then it gives them a chance to put their posters up as soon as they arrive on the Exeter main campus. So that'd be good. I think that they're the main things I wanted to say this morning, apart from we have some special badges here special papers, which we're trying to collect feedback on the day. We'll be asking you for feedback at the end of the conference. But throughout the conference, we're also likely to jot down what you're thinking about how it's going, how the conference is going, but more importantly also, what you think of the EBMA, what it means for you, and where you think you can get involved in the EBMA from here. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker of this session. We've got 2 excellent speakers in this session. The first speaker is Chris McManus, who is a professor of psychology and medical education at UCL. Chris has got a long-standing career in medical education, but more importantly in assessment. Has done lots of, written loads of papers all over the place on academic attainment and how that predicts levels of attainment and progression throughout doctors' and trainees' careers. And a lot of his work's covered both undergraduate and postgraduate fields. He's so impressive that I assumed he wasn't a proper doctor. And it wasn't until reading his biography recently that I realised he is a proper doctor and graduated from Cambridge. And then another thing recently, he's written a very fantastic editorial in BMJ Open recently as a response to Jeremy Hunt's announcement that England, UK, are now going to have an extra 25% of medical students. This is the sort of guy who is very, very proactive, very interesting, but also very entertaining speaker. And without further ado, Chris McManus.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Yes, it is working. I can hear it. Thank you very much. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, this is a hunt-free zone, okay? I don't want to talk about it. Let's talk about some other things. First of all, let me just thank the organisers, though. It's a wonderful meeting. There's so many, and that's excellent. And I think there's a lot of good things we need to talk about. Okay, my talk is a strange one, and it's really going to end up on the issue I'm interested in at the moment about the nature of remediation. What do we do when people are under-attaining? But I'm going to have to get there via a number of other things I've been interested in the last few years. So if I don't quite get to remediation immediately, forgive. I promise you it's meant to get there. Whether I have enough time, and I see good conference. Oh, we have got a clock there. That's all right. I'll try and keep on time. Okay. Underattainment is a recurrent problem. And it comes usually at boundaries. All these boundaries we have are transitions. Transitions are very threatening to people. They're very difficult for people. Anthropologists love them, of course. There's always a rite of passage associated with any transition. And in medicine, they're often marked by high-stakes exams. And they happen really when people go, say, from undergraduate to becoming a graduate, specialist training, and of course there's international boundaries as well, all of which are associated with these various rites of passage. I want to think about different groups in this. I'm going to talk about IMGs, International Medical Graduates, a bit, but actually we'll see it applies to UK graduates and indeed to graduates from different UK medical schools. So I want to try and bring all of these in, but some of it was driven by IMGs. I want to try and look at the size of the problem. This really refers to the IMG matter, which I got stuck into a while ago, and I'll give you a very brief meta-analysis of some of that. There is a problem of what we should expect about people, and this what to expect is not in the people, but it's our expectations. And I am going to get sidetracked slightly into what we expect in terms of equivalence. And then I want to go on to the real thing I'm interested in. It'll take a while to get there. How practical is remediation? And in particular, how can we work out how long we should remediate people for? Very often people say, oh, we'll send them on a 1-month refresher course. Is that enough? How will we know? So that's the sort of question I'm after here. Okay, there are two sort of backgrounds to this work, one of which is this paper, which I published with Kath Wolf and several other colleagues, and we talked about what we call the academic backbone. And there, it doesn't say anything which will come as a surprise to you in some ways, except I was hearing people say that these sort of things didn't happen. What this paper did was to look at looked about 5 or 6 large-scale longitudinal studies to see what were the continuities. And to give you an idea, I know this won't even be legible to the first row, but this was one of the big correlation matrices we had. GCSEs, A-levels, first, second, third, fourth, fifth year at medical school, and then we had a lot of MRCP data, part 1, part 2 PACES. And these are a whole load of students in a cohort study at UCL. If we look at the correlations in more detail, again, you don't need to see much, 0.7, 0.5, 0.7, 0.8. Essentially, if you do well in 1 year at medical school, you will do well in all the other years. And the flip side, if you do badly to start with, you're probably going to do badly in the other years. There's a massive continuity in these things. And we came up with this idea that we call the academic backbone. This is one of those structural models I love so much. But here we go. These IQ, GCSEs, A-levels. But I hope what you can see, everything is rippling through. All of the later events are influenced by performance at all of the earlier ones. And we called this the academic backbone because it was a rather sort of fanciful image on my part, but we took that picture, turned it on its side, so in here this is the end point, this is where you start from, the bottom as it were, and then we thought it looked rather like a backbone. And then in particular, it reminded me of the neck with all these different, the muscles around the edges, these don't just stand up, the muscles here are all supporting and constraining it so it doesn't fall over. So that's where the image came from anyway. But the academic backbone. So that was one of the threads which started this work. There is this continuity and we need to take it into account. The other thread came when I got involved on the working party the GMC set up on the MrcP Exam. And like many of these things, to start with, it was a data and evidence-free zone, and we rapidly tried to change that. And we wanted to look at how IMGs who'd taken MrcP were doing in their training. And one of the places we had data on both groups was things like the Mrcp exam, which I'm heavily involved with. So these are marks for 18,000 UK medical graduates taking Mrcp Part 1 at their first attempt. The pass mark is 0, the way we've scaled this. And what you can see is there's the pass mark. The mean, that's actually the mean. It's just slightly over the pass mark. The result is that about half of the UK candidates pass it at their first attempt. Now, you do the same thing for the IMGs. So now we've got 7,800 IMGs, and you'll instantly see that the distribution is shifted across to the left. There's the mean. You look at the difference between them, and you do a few fancy calculations, and you get that the effect size is about minus 0.9. They're almost the IMGs are almost a standard deviation below the UK medical graduates. Now, is that typical? Is it common? Or what? So we wanted to know where it came from and what the implications were. We did a meta-analysis, and I haven't published this one yet. We've managed to find 59 effect sizes for postgraduate exams. Quite a few people took them, not surprisingly. And we had them from 3 countries. We couldn't find them elsewhere. Mostly the UK, some from Canada, few from the US. Disappointingly few from the US, I always think. But when you do the meta-analysis, we've sorted the effect sizes here in terms of the size. These are knowledge tests. These are clinical assessments. And you can see, and that's no difference over there. So there's the occasional exam which might possibly have no difference. But mostly there's a difference where the IMGs under-attain. If we look at the summary of that, overall there's about a 1 standard deviation under-attainment. Knowledge tests, it's a little less at about 0.8. Clinical tests, it's more at about 1.4 standard deviations below. These are quite large effects, in other words. Now, that PLAB review asked some tricky questions. I don't think they'd realised how tricky they were. And they influenced a lot because they bring up all sorts of issues of fairness and equality. But there were 2 aspects of the terms of reference. One was to review whether the knowledge and skills demonstrated by a pass in the PLAB continue to be equivalent to those of doctors who have completed the first year foundation program. That's what the GMC wanted. And that's what I'm going to call entry equivalence. They also said to examine whether international medical graduates who pass the PLAB test, blah, 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 are more or less likely than other cohorts of doctors to experience difficulties in medical practice. In other words, they wanted to know whether the outcomes were the same for these people who may or may not have been selected on an equivalent entry exam. And these are very separate questions. It took me ages to see this, and I'll show you why. And to a large extent, I think entry equivalence and outcome equivalence are not possible at the same time. You might think they are, but they're not. And that has many implications. We could have tried to do this in the UK, but the UK data are not really up to it. When there's a medical licensing exam, they may be, but there's not at the moment. And the Canadian data are quite the easiest to see what's happening and why this is happening. This is a report on Canadian international medical graduates in Canada. And a couple of things. If we look at Canadian medical graduates taking the GP, family physician's exam or the physicians and surgeons exams, 90+% pass them at first attempt. Now look at the IMGs, 63%, 76%, 75%. So the IMGs are clearly under-attaining in Canada. So this isn't a UK problem alone. Now, the interesting thing about Canada is that the IMGs take exactly the same examination as the Canadian graduates with the same pass mark. There's total entry equivalence. And they take the Medical Council of Canada qualifying exam. So there is entry equivalence. I won't bore you with the details, just to show they exist. This here is the results when they take them. Canadian medical graduates, 98% pass at part 1, slightly lower at part 2, first attempt. Look at the IMGs, 66%, 72 or 44%, a lot lower. And in fact, when you work out the effect sizes, they're much what you'd expect. They're similar to elsewhere. So we've got a strange situation where there's outcome equivalence, there's entry equivalence in Canada, same exam, non-equivalence as far as outcomes are concerned. We need to know why. And it's relatively straightforward to see why. This is a little model we put together. We assume that the distribution of IMG abilities is lower than that of CMGs. And they shifted across, in other words, much like the data I showed you earlier for MRCP. If you set a pass mark on that exam, then a relatively small number of Canadians will fail, but rather more IMGs will fail. So we get rid of those people, and these ones then go into the training system. But notice what's happening. The average level of the, the average level of the IMGs is going to be lower than for the Canadian graduates. Calculate the means of the two groups. This mean is higher than this mean. In fact, you've still got an effect size of a standard deviation. So the fact they've taken the same exam and got in at the same level does not mean that they're not different later on. And that's why they're then under-attaining later on. So the entry qualification is not enough to suffice to produce equivalence. And this is a fundamental problem with any selection system. It's not just international. By the way, we call this the MedMod model. It's the most tongue-twisting acronym I've ever come up with. Mean entry difference and means a mean outcome difference. Those two will be different, and it has consequences. Now, it's worth asking, why might IMGs have a lower mean score wherever you look around the world on these things? And there it's relatively straightforward. We turn the question round. Why on earth should we expect them to have the same mean score as UK or Canadian or US medical graduates? And the answer, there's no reason at all. In the UK, we know that graduates of different UK medical schools are not the same in their postgraduate performance. Will we expect all graduates of all schools internationally to be equivalent? Well, it's a pious hope, but I can't believe it's true, and certainly haven't seen the evidence for it. And it's also worth remembering, I haven't got time to show you, IMGs may well be a non-random sample from their medical schools. I've got some data that certainly the IMGs taking MRCP are not the high flyers. They stay in, if you look at, say, India, they stay in India. It's the ones who are less good who are applying to take our exams. And the data on that are very clear. They also have very heterogeneous motivations for wanting to practice elsewhere. So there's every reason to believe they're not going to be equivalent to anything. Okay, so we've got this large group of people who are under-attaining in the UK system and elsewhere. And so we say, well, what about some remediation? So how might we set about doing it? And the real question is, how much might be possible? Or to put it another way, how much time might it take you to get people to the level you want them to be at? And that's the practical problem. And to answer that, I want to suggest that we've got to go back to considering not relative performance on exams. Those marks I showed you for MRCP, they show you the relative order, but they don't necessarily tell you the absolute performance. And what we need to consider is the absolute growth in medical knowledge, not relative. Partly we need to look at guessing corrected marks in MCQ. They start to tell us that. And what I want to argue is actually the place to really look at this is in progress tests. And I want to glance at a few results from progress tests because I think they give us something that no other form of assessment gives us. Now, those are the data I showed you earlier for MRCP Part 1 first attempt, except now this is the guessing, at the bottom is the guessing corrected % correct on the MCQ. So now that is 0. And 0 means they know nothing. They might as well have filled it in at random, and you feel sometimes they have. Now, if we look at the UK ones here, the UK knew 50% of the questions we asked them. And we can say that's a real 50%. The IMGs knew 41%. And what that means is, to put it crudely, on average, the UK graduates knew 24% more in absolute terms. So we're now going, not they're better, we're saying how much better they are. And that gives us quite a leverage on some of the problems. Now, progress tests, and I've chosen this nice example from Adrian and his colleagues, give us this not only in a single exam, but they do it over time, and we can see the growth in absolute knowledge. And so you can get graphs like this one from that paper. These are the same tests now at different times throughout the course, and you can see it's pretty well linear. The growth of knowledge is pretty well linear with time. And that suggests that what we have here is a continual accumulation of, I've called it medical capital, and that's what makes people doctors. Now, that's the average curve, but actually, not everybody's going to look like that. What we suspect happens is some of them are fast, some of them are slow. I haven't put it in, but some of them are so slow that they drop out there or are thrown out. So they will be growing at different rates, and that becomes rather important. Now, we can see a bit more of those different rates if we look at this paper from the Netherlands. And I think we've got at least one author in the audience. Not sure about the others. But this is a nice one. It's a complicated graph, but what we have here, this is an individual student. They're reaching that point, and for feedback and giving them advice, we want to know where they're likely to go next. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is this shows us typical performance on the 5th, 15th, 50th, 70th, and 95th percentiles. and we can draw some lines through them. And if you calculate the rate of growth on those lines, you'll see that the bottom fifth percentile, 3% knowledge per year, over 5% for the top ones. And in fact, if you calculate off here, notice the scale is 0, so we can actually do proper comparisons. These are guessing corrected, of course. We can see that the difference between the 95th and the 5th percentile, that 95th percentile know twice as much in the same course, in the same time. So they're growing at different rates. Okay, so let's try and take this and extend it further and work out where we can go. What I want to look at is absolute medical knowledge up the side here, where naught means nothing. According to, here they start in year naught when they do know nothing. They go through the years of undergraduate, foundation, specialty training, or whatever. I'm not too worried about the details here. But from typical progress tests, in the UK anyway, we'd think that this goes up relatively linearly. You've seen that. And I'm presuming that it carries on going up linearly. Doctors continue to learn. And I'd like to think it actually goes up to about the 5th floor in this building, as senior consultants are still continuing to learn. We certainly hope they are. We'd like to know if they are. But certainly we can assume there's continual learning throughout a medical career, and certainly across this period here. A good graduate will have a steeper curve. We've seen they differ in their slopes, and I'm assuming they'll carry on at a higher rate. And the weaker ones will have a rather lower slope here, and progress will be less fast. Now, I come into this in a sense when they decide to take MRCP, because for the first time I've got a measure on all of the graduates and I can compare what they're doing. And what I hope you'll see is that the typical graduates probably get their MRCP Part 1, ST1 maybe a bit before. A good graduate could actually take it in FY1, and many of them do take it in FY2 and find it really rather easy. And they say it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Alternatively, there are other weaker ones who, if they were allowed to, they might get it in ST4, but usually they've dropped out of the physician's training scheme by then. So we're going to expect differences in the attainment of these major transitions, these high stakes exams. Okay, so that's the UK. Remember, these are differences between students. We're assuming that these aren't differences between medical school training programs. But what happens about IMGs? Let's go back to them. We have an IMG who comes in and they're broadly equivalent to FY1, FY2, and we assume they must have got to that position by linear growth, and on average they're less good than the average UK graduate, the grey lines, and therefore we might predict they're going to do that. And what we can see here is that they're now going to get their MRCP later if they get it. But certainly they're not going to find it as easy, the pass rates will be lower and so on. But they might not be as bad as many of our homegrown graduates who don't get to that point. So this will be an average IMG with typical training. Now, where this gets interesting, of course, is that we've already said medical schools may not be the same the world over. And it may be if you're an IMG from somewhere, then your undergraduate training was really not as good as that in the UK. Certainly in the UK, we'd like to think that. And any postgraduate experience you had may also not be as good. So, and yet you're still at that level. You've done quite well. What happens, though, if we now drop you're one of the brighter IMGs in that group. They had a poor undergraduate environment, but we now drop you into an excellent training environment. Well, now you've got the opportunities to start to learn at an accelerated rate. And then you can you'll pass your MRCP not very soon, maybe even at the same time as the typical UK graduates. Alternatively, as sadly is what really happens much of the time, we take an average IMG, they had a poor undergraduate environment, and we drop them into some of the worst training environments in the UK, where not surprisingly, they don't find it very easy to learn. And if that's the case, they're probably going to, perhaps might even go up at a lower rate, and they're going to have troubles attaining postgraduate exams. So we've now realizing that with the IMGs, their environment is changing potentially quite dramatically when they arrive in the UK. Now, can we use that to ask for these IMGs, would some high-quality remedial training be of help? That's the practical question we want to answer. And if so, do we send them off to for 3 months to one of the best units in the country? No point in scrimping on this. Or 6 months, or a year, 2 years? How long do they need in order to get up onto the trajectory they then need to carry on? And we can begin to see, in a sense, how we would do that. Here's a UK graduate passing at that point, and here's one of the better IMGs in a very good training environment passing at that point. What's that difference there? Well, it's about half of a year, probably. These are all estimated values, don't take any of them as being fixed. But probably 3 to 6 months of high-quality remedial training would bring that graduate there back onto the same track as the UK graduate. In fact, if we got them back to that point, they carry on at a higher rate then, because they're actually quite good. They just haven't had the opportunity to express that being quite good. So maybe 3 months, 6 months would do the job there. What about the average one? Well, now we start to look and we see we're talking about a year or two, perhaps. So if they're coming from here, they're going to need quite a lot of extra work. And of course, this one here, well, that line is right over here somewhere. It's off the screen. It's difficult to see how they're going to get it. And you can almost see that the weakest ones in poor environments, they might need as long for remediation as they've already had in undergraduate training. We may need to just start again with them. And even then, it may not work. So what I want to suggest is, by looking at things like progress tests, thinking about absolute knowledge, we can start to ask questions about how much remediation we might need. What's realistic? What's possible? And I don't think we should assume that anybody can be remediated from any position. I don't think that's sensible or practical. Last thing, what about the UK? Those were the IMGs. What about the UK? Well, it is just worth reminding ourselves that UK graduates aren't wonderful either. Well, many of them aren't. That's roughly the 95% confidence interval. And roughly speaking, the top ones answer 3/4 of these questions correctly. The bottom ones answer 1/4. That's 3 times as much knowledge. And that's a huge thing to make up. And that may be why some of these people never pass MRCP. They take it a few times and they give up. There's just too much of a hill to climb to get up to the right level. And where that comes from is another matter, and we could speculate on that one. Okay, so some quick conclusions. IMGs underperform for multiple reasons. It's partly poor medical training at home, I suspect, some self-selection, but it does happen in all the countries we're looking at, and more. Interestingly, there's a lovely paper I found somewhere from the Times of India, where the Indian Council for Medical Education is, Indian Medical Council, like GMC, they're testing doctors who train abroad, and only 25% are passing if they've trained in Nepal or Ukraine or various other places. So this isn't even a first developed world problem. This is wider than that. Entry equivalence is an ethical necessity, of course, but it won't guarantee that they all then do equally well. You have to be really careful. Is remediation possible? Well, I think this applies to UK graduates as well as IMGs. It's just easier to see and to think about it for IMGs. You need extra time in high-quality training. How much will depend on what level of ability they're at, what their previous training's like, and what's the training environment they've been dropped into. But I think we have to accept it may not be pragmatically feasible in a realistic time frame. So we need remediation, but we've got to think about it in a more quantitative sense. I'll finish there. Thank you. Slightly over, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chris. We've got time for some questions. We can get the microphones working.
Sorry, who's choosing the questions?
So we've got a question over here, and some.
Now, the microphone is choosing the questions, of course.
I hope. Is this working now? Well, Charles. Sam de Rezer from Belgium. Hello, everybody. I have 2 questions. One is related to the graduates, you mentioned some of the difficulties, but other difficulties are like language and difference of culture, medical culture that is different.
Yes.
So that are reasons that nothing have to do with capacity, I think. And there is also a problem with giving them high quality training, because we also want to reserve that high quality training environments for our own good graduates who need to become the leaders for the future.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. There are many factors. In fact, in current medical education, Jan Illing and her team have a lovely review of all the things that make it hard for international graduates to attain in the country they come to. I'm treating all other things as being equal. Let's assume language isn't a problem, etc., etc. There are maybe cultural differences and so on. But even if that's taken into account, you have to think about these possible influences. So I don't doubt the role of any of those things. You may need remediation in those, and that may be even harder than remediating medical knowledge and so on. As far as for our own graduates is concerned, I have my doubts about this one. If we're trying in the NHS anyway to provide a high quality service to everyone, what we want to do is not to run the NHS merely for the high flyers so they can attain extremely highly. We want a service which is at the right level for everybody. And I think there's a strong argument, actually, that we send the best doctors off to the worst training programs, and vice versa, or we do it at random. I suspect if some of our best graduates ended up in some of the least doctored parts of the country, they would actually learn one hell of a lot about the real world. They wouldn't under-attain. They're bright, they're informed, and they do very well. So I don't think we need to restrict what we're doing to the very brightest. Even if we do, we ought to actually do a study to find out whether it matters. And my idea would be a randomized controlled trial where we randomly send people to parts of the country and see how they attain. Sorry. I do like to be provocative when possible.
Chris, hi. I was wondering, the assumption that knowledge is zero at the beginning for UK medical students. Have you looked and seen whether actually there's a difference between, say, a life sciences graduate who comes in and does a 4-year course compared to an A-level student?
No. The simple answer is that, of course, that the schools with progress tests are relatively few. The data are not readily available. I've gleaned most of this from what's been published. I haven't got access to raw data, mainly. There may be a sense in which if you've done already done a PhD in molecular genetics or something, as some have, then some bits of the course will be easier. And some bits of the progress test, but Adrian and other people who run progress tests, what proportion of those progress tests would actually be answerable from a PhD in molecular genetics? My guess is only 1 or 2 questions. They still don't tell you what to do with the patient in casualty who's got whatever. So I think we can pretty well assume it's 0. It may be slightly higher. The graduate entrants do better. Your data at King's show that. It's very clear from the data I've seen. And that's probably because they're faster learners. And that's different from knowing more when they came in. But we need to know more about what those rates are.
Kichu Noy from Australia. I'm an IMG. Could you comment on the patient outcome between IMGs and local graduates?
In the UK, I think we know relatively little about it. I think most things we're really interested in, we know relatively little about. We do know that some IMGs in the UK are producing the highest quality care imaginable. And that's not a surprise, because when we look at, say, the Mrcp exam, some of the IMG scores are way up above 95% of the UK graduates. So it's not surprising they're going on to deliver superb care. The average performance, I think it would be extremely hard to know what it is. Give me the data and I can, Archimedes said, give me a large enough stick, I'll move the earth, but I haven't got the stick, so I can't find out what's going on. Data is the real shortage in this whole game, and that's what we want to know.
Okay, well, thank you for your questions. We'll keep any other questions until after Val's talk. We should have some time for some questions for Val in particular, and then possibly for both speakers. So I'd like to introduce Val Wass, who is Emeritus Professor at Keele University, Keele Medical School. She led the medical school program there as head of school for many years. She's got a fantastic history of academic-related research, which is mainly in the field of assessment instruments for the assessment of clinical skills. And she's got a lot of papers published in that. She did a PhD on that work, and she's got a whole load of publications through that. She was chair of the Medical Schools Council Assessment Alliance for many years, and is now chairing the...
That's enough.
Now chairing... She's very special. And she's now chairing the GMC Assessment...
Advisory Committee.
They
won't do what we advise them, but we do advise them.
There you go.
Therein lies the...
Okay, so here we go, Val Walsh.
Okay. Am I on? Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to preamble because discussion is important to me, but it's so lovely to be here and wonderfully European, and I just want to congratulate you, Adrian, because you've put so much effort into getting us all together. So when you go back and you think, why 6 months ago did I write this title? What was I thinking of? We were thinking about boundaries. I was thinking of challenging you, Chris, because...
And you wrote my title as well.
Right. Hang on, get this the right way around. I think that's it. So what was I thinking about? Well, I think many of you will know about Alice in Wonderland, and would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? Well, that depends where you want to go. I don't much care. Well, I don't want to seem flippant. It's not that I don't much care, but I do think perhaps this time we could be thinking a bit about where we go. And if we're doing so as we're crossing boundaries, does it matter which way we go? And are we perhaps tied into thinking that we do have to go in one direction, the academic bone direction, perhaps? Backbone, sorry, Chris. Got it in the wrong place. So thoughts only start with doubt. So what I'd really like to do today is to share with you as we launch into this conference, and we can work together, as you say, Leslie, to work together, to share with you some doubts I do have now about the way we're going. And I know they will build on what Eric and Case you want to say too in future. So I want to think about the linear route. I mean, I think we would all agree, Chris, your route is linear. It's going across the boundaries, but based on a linear direction for knowledge acquisition. Is that necessarily the right direction for future graduates? So much has happened. So I then want to share my doubts, talk about some theories of non-linearity, which are coming out at the moment, and introduce them into thoughts for the conference, and then talk a bit about whither next. So let's think about this linear route. Many of you will know of the Wizard Odd, yellow brick road, straight up there, and we'll get there. Well, we've got here Dorothy, the lion, the scarecrow, and the Tin Man. This has been my route for so long, and I am doubting my route at the moment. So, if you were the scarecrow, you might be just a new scarecrow, and you want to go to the wizard to learn to be an expert. If you're the Tin Man, well, you might be a very valid Tin Man, but you're wanting to be much more reliable because you freeze up and you need a bit of oil. So you're going to the Wizard of Oz to become an expert. Competence versus excellence. The lion has seen one kill. He's killed a deer, but he really wants to be excellent to know he can do it without people around him, and he needs the experience. How is he going to get that? And of course, Dorothy is torn between the wicked witch of the summative and the good witch who's trying to be much more formative. And of course, the Wizard of Oz is going to answer all these. Well, this has been my trajectory for a long time, that we really must try to move from that red side to the green side and become much more formative. And I'm not seeing that happening so much, particularly in the UK, where those of you from other countries may not be aware. We are now moving towards having a medical licensing assessment, which seems pretty much inevitable, but which is moving my pendulum much more back to the summative. And I want to question why we're having so much trouble moving towards the formative. So knowledge acquisition. Chris, why do we think, because we have a lot of knowledge, we're necessarily a better doctor? And why are we now working so far as to much knowledge you have in your head through the progress test, when in fact it's at everybody's fingertips now? How many of our students actually go there? They go there for their knowledge. Now, I know it's a tricky thing for us to think about. How much knowledge is the doctor of the future going to need? And I got in really deep water with some surgeons in Plymouth the other day when I suggested that perhaps you didn't need to know every nerve within the body. And there was a lovely feedback. I'm sure he gave me pause, saying, what does that woman mean we don't need? And of course they need their anatomy. I've never Googled anything in my life. So I think as educators we need to be thinking that, and often when you ask a question, where do they go for the knowledge? Straight to the iPhone, and they're doing that. I too was very much part of splitting knowledge into learning, clinical competence into knowledge, skills and attitudes. Very neat. It's a very neat way for assessing assessment. And yet what have we learnt? That you can't actually communicate unless you have the knowledge. And we may have very knowledgeable doctors, Chris, but if you look to where the complaints come about doctors, they're inevitably communication. And you can think about attitudes. Can we assess them separately? Well, actually, we know from the work we've done on professionalism and Brian Hodges' work, which was looking with an international group for professionalism, not only do you actually have to be able to define it, and that's very culturally sensitive, but you do have to, professionalism is something that's very embraced within knowledge and skills and with where you're working. You can't just assess it in isolation. It actually works within the individual, within the teams you're working with and with society. So it's integrated, and I'm worried about that separation. Competence-based curricula. Well, I'm going to come to that later, but where the worries that are emerging about competence and whether, like the lion, have its one kill enough or do you need the experience? And of course, workplace-based assessment has been a fascinating thing to watch, hasn't it, Keith? Because there it started as a wonderful formative idea where we had all these tools we could use creatively. And it's become just part of Chris's linear progression, that before you go to do your final exams, you have to have scores and marks and showed you've done your workplace-based assessment. And I know from my trips to Cyprus and Kosovo that it's following exactly the same way there. So it's something we share across Europe. So somehow we haven't been able to get our heads around taking workplace assessment outside this linear route. And tomorrow I've got to excuse myself because I'm going to my 50th year reunion of starting at medical school. And so this is very new to me, not new to me at the front of my mind, is just how much in those 50 years medicine has changed. When I was a medical student, the ward was full of men who'd had heart attacks, 28 days bed rest with a bedpan. My consultant, if somebody had a hematemesis bleeding from their stomach, believed that you should draw the curtains round and get them to suck ice. Now, my registrar was beginning to do endoscopy, so we used to wheel them off silently. But a huge change over those years in how we move forward. If you typed a paper and you made some corrections, your secretary had to type the whole thing out again. So technology has changed acutely. And I think medicine has too. And I'm not sure knowledge is going to be what we need to prepare ourselves for a lifetime of uncertainty, change, challenge, and self-created opportunity. Because I think medicine of the future is already so much more complex than it was 50 years ago. And you could imagine with climate change, changing world dominance, all the things that are happening in the world around us now, what it's going to be like for the future doctor. They're going to need different skills, and the competencies that are easy to assess will be done by other workers. So I love this quote, but I think it very much links to where we're going. That if we're going to operate in this vastly changing global environment, and we're here globally today to look at this. I love the walking on quicksand and dancing with electrons, but I think it is amassing valid experience that we need. Not necessarily knowledge, Chris, but we can debate that. And to see connections in chaos, which flourish and find opportunities in every disturbance. And that's not more within the learner, and why we're moving much more to assessment for learning. They're the skills that we need to be moving to. So what are my doubts? This case, it was a really good symposium, and Eric's in the audience too somewhere. Where is Eric? Right, Eric. It was a very good symposium that we had at EBMA on competence-based assessment. And this is Pim Tunuson's slide. He's given me permission to slow you here, which really hit me at the time, and which I think would it be fair, Eric, we rather skirted around. I know you were on the other side of the debate, but what Case was saying is, this is wrong. What Pim was saying is wrong. Pim is a young O&G consultant. What you're doing as educators is putting a wedge between our learning and our working. You're making us do so many learning tasks that aren't connecting at all with the working environment we're in and where we actually are learning. There's a disconnect, and you're forcing us into it. This is Pim. Whatever competencies are, they're not capturing what it means to be a health professional. And I think we have to hear that if what we're doing to our young is pushing them away from their direction of travel. And this is what I really believe we should be moving towards now. This is Dick Cruiser's modification of the Miller's Systems of Competence. That it's not just the does, that's not enough. What our learners need to have when they emerge and become physicians is identity. And they've got to consistently demonstrate the attitudes, values, and behaviors expected of one who's thinking, acting, and feeling like a physician, which is rather more than what the does that we're currently doing does. This is from Pim as well, and worries me a lot, particularly with our I've seen some people from the GMC here. I saw Richard here somewhere earlier. We're moving now towards having generic competencies. Well, I've just already said professionalism isn't generic. I mean, I may be quite good professionally, but I remember an awful time in casualty in the middle of the night where I didn't want to admit a lady fell out with her son. We admitted her, she died, so I felt awful, but he then managed to find me and put her creme form through my post box on Christmas Day. So we're not always professional, it depends on the context. And so what Dr. Van Loon has done is look at these entrustable professional activities. I don't know whether he knows about them, but they're getting people to actually assess what they're doing in the workplace and show what they've achieved. So they looked at over 5,000 of these in Holland, and they found that only 0.5% related to anything generic. They mostly related to what they were doing technically or in the experience of what they met in the environment. And finally, Chris, you have given me a lot of doubt, Chris Harrison at Keele, looking at our feedback in a summative situation. So what Chris did was he decided that we had all this data from our OSCEs, but we weren't necessarily feeding it back to our patients, to our students. And so when their results came out, everything that they'd done across the 12 OSCE stations went on the web, how they'd performed in the different domains, with a nice little bit about now you can make a learning plan for the next year. So what happens? This is looking at the, going up here, you've got the number of views of the web pages when the results came out. The failing students who failed actually did use the web because they had to retake the exam. The excellent and good, yes, they went up and they looked at it, but were they making their action plans? They weren't looking at what they'd done, they were looking at what their colleagues had done. So they were looking competitively at across it. And of course, the really worrying area in terms of your thoughts about remediation, Chris, are the just passing students or the satisfactory ones who needed the learning plans to get better, but were in fact just saying, well, I've passed, that's all I need to do. I've passed, I'll plant it. I'll look again in a year's time when I have to do another OSCE. A total disconnect between what they were being assessed on and their learning. So they're my doubts about where we are, and this is why I'm very attracted by non-linearity and not just following one single linear route when we're looking at what we're doing. It's defined as a rule that determines what part of a system is going to do next. It's not influenced by what it's doing now. Does that apply to medicine? Well, Eric, the paper you've done with Steve Durning was really very helpful indeed, I think, and I would urge people to look at that. But there they say, well, if you're wanting to decide whether you're in a non-linear system, then ask questions of it. I've chosen 4 of the 6 in the paper. Can and do multiple parts of a system interact? Well, they do in medicine, don't they? And we're talking a lot about working much more in teams and the complexity of professionalism that Brown Hodges' paper points out, that it's not only the team, it's the institution. Do small changes in initial conditions lead to very large difference in outcome? Well, definitely. Some of the mistakes I've made have been, well, nearly always, when I didn't in that first instance listen to the patient properly and then went in the wrong direction. And it would have been much better if I had listened. So small changes can lead to large differences in outcome. Does a system involve human interactions? Goes without saying, doesn't it? And are they inherently unpredictable? I don't think it is necessarily a linear route. And what about the know it when I see it? Well, that's how we work as physicians. It's pattern recognition, and that's how we're working together. And or it depends phenomenon. These are huge decisions that a physician is having to make all the time, and which leads, I think, a much more chaotic approach to how we do it. So this too comes from the Durning paper. Medical practice is impacted by uncertainty and ambiguity, which is seldom discussed from our assessment perspective, which is about the effects of reliability and validity. So, with the next. Well, I'm not for a minute saying that we should throw what we are up on the wall. In case I know you feel the same, we both feel that competency-based assessment is here for patient safety. Eric, you said the same. We have to start somewhere. But we are at the moment in the UK in this key position of having an MLA, a medical licensing assessment coming. And this key thing that if we're going to have liberally educated graduates, who I believe is what we need for the skills of the future, it's rather than competent technicians, which I think is where competency-based education takes you and means other people can take our jobs, is what makes a university a university. And I think we're at an interesting point in the UK of whether we move with that linear route towards an MLA or whether we have the courage to say, GMC, you do it, and then we'll concentrate on making our doctors fit for the future, rather than trying to integrate the two and move together linearly. So, I do not think that there shouldn't be a rainbow at the end that we're aiming for, and that we shouldn't have doctors fit for the future. But I do think it should be a windy route. So to accomplish things, we must not only act. And obviously we've got a wonderful opportunity for the next 2 days, thanks to Adrian and the EBMA team, to think together how we act. But we also need to dream. And my dream would be that we can actually move towards changing assessment, so it can be absolutely purely assessment for learning, so that actually it is the learner who's directing how they're assessed, and moving through with a mentor, so that we can create a much more caring educational environment where you've got another more senior colleague who's caring for you and helping you through. I think that would improve patient care. So it's much more led. We can plan, yes, but we can also believe. And what do I believe? Well, I believe that in this room here, we really have the young who will take us forward. We've got some wonderful new up-and-coming psychometricians here. Well, we've got Carlos here in the front line. Avgis from Cyprus is here somewhere. I've just met John from somewhere else as well. If you can all get together and begin to think, because there are these huge issues we've just been tackling in Cyprus. There you are, Avgis, I can see you. If you've got 9 people in a competency postgraduate assessment, how are you going to make a standard, particularly when it's a new assessment? And these are all the challenges that we need to move away from classical test linear theory and try and think of other ways to do it. We've also got people trying to think of other things. Amir, I saw you just stand up. You're right at the back, aren't you? Amir is presenting on his iPad, where you can try to get away from queuing in single best answers so that people have to think much more of their ways forward. So I believe in this room here, if we can think a bit more non-linear, we've got a way to go forward. So if I met the Cheshire Cat, what would I say? What I want is clinicians who are empowered through assessment for, not of, learning to develop a strong personal professional identity, putting the top to that triangle. In experience, not competence, because I think we're hearing from our learners that you're focusing too much on competence and tick boxing, and that's not what we're experiencing in our working environment. And the future is going to be, I'm quite sure, much more complex, much more globalized, contain more risk, and potentially much more chaotic for the 21st century medicine. And I think we as educators really need to get our heads around that. Then, does it matter which way we go? That's up to you to decide. Because I think probably, as I move to my doubts, it's beyond me. So I thought I probably ought to end with somebody wiser than myself, which is Einstein. So everything that can count can't necessarily count. Chris, you've got something you can count, but how much should we be concentrating on it? I love him dearly. You don't mind, do you? And everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. Well, let's just try and think a bit more how we could count those things that are difficult to count. So I'll rest my case there. Thank you, Tom.
So, are we going to... Is this on? Yep. There we go.
Thank you very much. Phil Smith from Cardiff. So with the rise of robotics and with the doubling of processing power every 2 years, it's very likely that things are going to change increasingly rapidly over the next 10 and 20 years in terms of what robots are able to do, such as taking a history and understanding and getting the right diagnosis, even doing operations and that sort of thing. So are we teaching medical students, are they learning things that actually for jobs that will not exist?
I suppose you have to think, I suppose it's beholden on us to try and make sure that there is a job that would still exist. And I think most of us would still wonder whether robots can really tackle the complexity. I mean, where are we? I just always remember a surgeon when we were talking about this. So he was president of the College of Surgeons saying, the buck will always stop with me. When something goes wrong, I'm the one who's carried the blame. I think there always will need to be a professional who can carry the blame, because you can't really take a robot to court. But what do you think?
Well, I think that the role will be in empathy and the human things, the communication and the touch and that sort of thing, rather than us necessarily having the knowledge or even applying the knowledge. I think that all of those things might be taken over, but it's the human things that will always be needed.
Yeah, good.
Yes, hi, Debbie Jarsma from the University of Groningen. I really both liked your talks. And I think there's sort of a sense of some false dichotomies in here. Maybe even like the discussions about qualitative versus quantitative. I think everything is necessary. It's linearity and non-linearity. It's complexity and simple. And I think what we need to strive for, and I think that's also the message Pim gave, how do we engage with all of us in embracing that complexity, but also trying to find the simple, because the simple works in the workplace. And I know that's difficult, and we'll talk about it, the symposium on tomorrow afternoon as well. But there's a sense of dichotomy I think is maybe a little dangerous as well.
But is Pim saying that the simple works in the workplace? I thought Pim was saying you were making what's happening in the workplace too simple. Did I get him right, Case? Or?
Well, I think he's actually saying
Case
it wasn't
might be able to help me
aligned.
here.
Well, no, I'm going actually to talk about the
I know.
wealth of the simple and the complex. I join Debbie in arguing that it's a false dichotomy.
Good.
We should embrace both.
Good.
And we'll show a best practice where it can be done. It's really complex, but it can be done. Our veterinarians, our doctors, really like the simple message, but they need to understand the complexity underneath it.
Good.
And there it becomes complex. Sorry. Thanks.
Thank you. So a quick question while I'm walking to the back. What does this mean for the medical licensing assessment? In terms of, we obviously have linear processes which are being suggested we're going to have probably a knowledge-based exam. So this is the national exam, which in England we'll have in 2022. This is for our European and international members, which will probably have 3 parts. One will be a knowledge test, one will be a clinical test, which will probably end up being taken at undergraduate level. And then there's going to be a 3rd part, which may end up involving some sort of revalidation. Once our graduates, even at the IMGs, when they come in, they'll have to take this 3rd part too, which involves some sort of revalidation in the workplace. Now, this brings in that non-linearity into the assessment, doesn't it? So can you just answer, do you think that will help? And what would you like to see in that 3rd part of the assessment?
I'm with my partner in crime here, because I'm sure he'll want to come in as well. You can borrow my microphone. I can see an inherent danger in the MLA unless we can really take it. I mean, either we put it separate and say there is this linear route and we want to do something different. Where I think the inherent dangers in the MLA are if they don't kind of stick to that. I mean, it's going to be a minimal competence test where you're already hearing people say, well, we could use it to rank. How can you rank people on a minimal competence test? We've seen that we've got a prescribing skills assessment, which then became a safety assessment because people said this written assessment can't attest skills. So it's about a safety minimum knowledge. But then already we've got people putting in difficult questions saying, well, we've got to give a prize for the person who does best in the PSA. And the pass rate is now 60%, whereas it's a safety test. So these things are really tricky. And we've got to watch, just like workplace-based assessment has veered to the red rather than being in the green. It's how it's handled, Tom, that I think is really absolutely critical for us. Chris, you may have some views. But you better get to the back of the room, Tom. Isn't that where you were going?
Yeah, he was. He's got a microphone.
Oh, good. I'll forgive you then.
Hi. Yes, okay, it's working. What I'm wondering, and your talk was great, Val. I agree with you 100%. My laptop is just loading because I was looking at a headline. What I'm wondering is whether our perspective on knowledge might be one of the problems in this particular dilemma. The example that I have, now forgive me for quoting the Daily Mail, the headline is, butter isn't bad for you at all. Major study says AT's advice on dairy fats was flawed. So many of us are aware of that. And I think that, to me, highlights a central issue about how we talk about knowledge. We talk about knowledge in the present continuous tense, but knowledge changes. And we've talked a lot about change. Change is important. So actually, I even challenge the idea of a progress test. Are we testing progress, or are we testing stagnation? All right. Should we be getting an award for knowing the same things that we knew 10 years ago? Or actually, should we be getting an award for being more dynamic in the way that we think and the way that we work with patients?
Well, and Chris may want to come in. I'm quite sure physicians need to keep up to date. I think John Norsini's work's very clear that as we get more experience, we think it's the other things that matter, but where we're in deficit if we're not keeping up to date. So it's absolutely crucial you do that. I suppose in my head, I'm not sure whether we will be keeping up to date here in our cortex, or whether we will having ways around us of looking up to date. In my own clinical practice, I was using the computer and looking things up much more than saying, I know this definitely. Chris, what do you think? How much knowledge do we need in the future? I don't know. You may.
Am I on? Yes, I am. So I move away from the speaker. Can you hear me now? Yeah? Actually, am I on? Sorry. Yeah. I don't know, knowledge is a difficult thing because people talk about knowledge and somehow it means facts, and facts are dry and boring. And therefore, why would we want anybody to learn those? Now, actually, most facts that we have in the world are underpinned by theory. And theories are complex, and they do change, they evolve, but they're not always utterly fluid. Do you remember that bit in Moliere's Imaginary Physician, where the patient comes in and the doctor says, well, I see your heart here is on the right side. And the patient says, I thought the heart was on the left side. And the physician looks at him and says, no, we've changed all that. Now, not everything does change. We could define what we mean by it and various other things. But I think, you know, facts do matter, but they matter because they're underpinned by a very much greater amount than that. I think we use knowledge tests, not, of course, because that's all that matters, because they're indicators of other things. They're flags about the wide range of stuff. If they're blueprinted, you're sampling a whole domain. And if they don't know that, they probably don't know something else. And the final thing on knowledge may be overrated. Ignorance, well, do we really want more ignorance?
Okay, let's move on. We have a question over here.
Hello, Jacob Pearce from the Australian Council for Educational Research. I wanted just to draw attention to potentially another of the false dichotomies in that presentation, which I thought was great. But the summative-formative dichotomy and the striving for assessment for learning, which I think is a great thing. But assessment for learning, if by that you mean timely, effective and data-driven and data-rich feedback for student learning, then that shouldn't be regardless of the stakes of the exam. So high-stakes examinations can and should be formative.
Yeah, I think by assessment for learning, I mean that the learner will direct their assessments, and part of that direction with it will be high-stakes things, but they've got to learn other things on the way. Is that answering what you're saying? Perhaps we both interpret assessment for learning different. I mean, student-directed assessment, so that they can work out and make action plans from what they're doing all the way along to get better and better. Can you come back on that? You've got a frown.
That does make sense, but that shouldn't be reserved only for the work-based or formative instruments. I mean, high-stakes data gives you that opportunity as well. Exactly, I agree. So if you're direct to your own learning, you've obviously got to work towards the high stakes and learn from them as well. So in my head, it's integrated. Does that help?
Can I come in on dichotomies? The psychologists have an old joke. It's usually when people say, well, we can divide people into two types, those who are extroverts and introverts. And the old joke goes that psychologists divide two people into two types, those who divide people into two types and those who don't. In general, there aren't two types of anything. Most dichotomies are false. Go back to Hegel, and of course it's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and it's the synthesis that matters. But humans do have a tendency to oversimplify by dividing things into two types. But it doesn't mean that's the way the world is. There aren't tall and short people. It's a nice way of thinking about people, but actually there's a continuum. So the dichotomy will fail, inevitably, because it's more complicated than that.
Exactly,
So.
and I don't think either of us believe there's a dichotomy.
No.
I think we're presenting it so we can feed cases plenary this evening. That's the point.
Okay, we got a question there.
John Cookson, one time Hull York Medical School in the UK. Do you think that the patient safety agenda has got a lot to answer for? We can't argue really against patient safety. We all want patient safety. But does the regulatory framework that's being put behind that actually, in the long term, make the patient experience more dangerous? I note that risk was in your last but one slide.
Yeah, I think you've heard my views, John, that I think certainly in terms of medical education, focusing so much on the patient-centred medicine and patient-centred has taken our eye off also the doctor side of it, because patients, it's a two-way interaction between doctor and patient. We focus totally on what the patient, how we should communicate, how it should be centred on them. And my argument with me, we've got to focus much more on the doctor side of the interaction at that new tip to the triangle of developing their own professional identity. And as somebody said, Anselm, I think it was from Belgium, it's everything's so culturally complicated, we've got to be able to understand ourselves as well. So I think that's not exactly, so I think we have to have patient safety, but we have to also think about doctor safety. and how they're going to protect themselves in this chaotic environment. I mean, an F2 was telling me the other day, you know, you're in casualty, you've been up all night, you've got patients on the trolleys. When you're starting your interaction, your patient-centered, you've got a furious patient, but you're also at your lowest ebb because you've been dealing with you know, 20 or 30 other. We've got to care for the doctor side of the interaction as well, and we're not doing that well enough, I believe, at the moment. So I think patient-centeredness, patient safety, yes, must be there, but the doctor has to be there too. And it's small wonder we've got so many problems with our young doctors at the moment, because they've rather been left out and devalued. And I think that's our fault partly.
But let's think about patient safety, and it depends which bits of it you define, but there was a sense in which 30 years ago patients were going to doctors who did utterly bizarre things idiosyncratically because they wanted to. We've then had a whole series of sort of preferred care pathways, or whatever we want to call them, recommended treatments, you know, the sort of stuff. And we now recognise that good practice is if you get a patient with this, you should probably do this and this and that. And they should be on that drug and so on. And that's safer for them. They're less likely to suffer side effects to whatever. Fine. But this comes back now to the point that Val brought up. You know, why don't we get algorithms to do that? Google could implement that in the NHS within days. So why don't we? Well, of course, somebody has to oversee the algorithms. How do we decide that what we think is the safe thing is actually the wrong thing? BMJ's had a series of analyses of randomized controlled trials where it's quite clear now that the patients are dying from the drugs which were recommended in the trials which are overseen by the regulators, etc., etc. There was one last week before. And therefore somebody's got to oversee it. And they're the people with the understanding, the knowledge, the sophisticated technical expertise to work out what's going on. And so doctors, at one level, they're just giving out the routine things. At another level, they've got to say, hang on, this doesn't work. And that's where patient safety will change, and it won't come through looking it up. Looking it up will just, algorithms looking it up will just instantiate the status quo, and nothing will ever change again.
Yeah, and in the complexity that it's not just one algorithm at the moment, we're dealing with comorbidity. We're going to have to try and combine 4 algorithms on different things.
Yeah.
Can I come back? Because the issue in my head really is slightly different, and that is, do we actually prevent people, doctors, from doing things because they're not trained? But they can't be trained because they can't actually do it. We get into a catch-22 situation, all for good reasons.
Yeah.
But
the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, we don't doubt that.
Yeah, but I think perhaps we need to recognise those good intentions.
I think a lot of it's like thinking about the army, actually, where if you've got a lot of young men armed with lethal devices, you have to have a lot of rules in order to keep them under control. Certainly when they're going into very dangerous situations, like trying to shoot other young men with lethal devices. And therefore, there's strict discipline, there's all sorts of rules, etc. That doesn't apply to the officer corps. At some point, somebody has to say, this doesn't work, let's change that. And I think you've got to decide what you're trying to do it for. At the cutting edge, in casualty, when the patient's coming in with this particular set of symptoms, there is something that probably has to be done. They've got the lethal devices, they're in syringes now, and they've got to decide what to do. But somebody has to stand right back and see this bigger picture, and it comes from a position of understanding, which is based on knowledge.
And take the buck when it goes wrong. I'm thinking of my cremation form through my letterbox.
Absolutely.
So with the, another question for both of you is with entrustable professional activities. I mean, a lot of the reason why we're now developing entrustable professional activities is because it's about safety. It's about clinicians trusting a doctor to do a particular activity and setting a level of, this doctor can do it under distant supervision or under very close supervision. So how do you think, going back to the sort of formative aspect of assessment, which is, I really liked your analogy, Val, about on the Wizard of Oz, about the green side being formative and about learning, assessment for learning, whereas the red side was summative and assessment of learning. How can we make entrustable professional activities in a way that we implement them sort of swing that pendulum back over to the right.
I find that I haven't done them, and I think it's the people who are doing them. So I don't know whether anybody in the audience is actually experiencing these at the moment, because neither Chris and I do them, so it's really hard to...
MRCP is battling with how they're implemented within the context of a postgraduate exam, and I'm not probably the best person to discuss it. Phil may be better than I am, but they're certainly on the agenda, and there's a lot of consideration.
Is somebody here doing them? Would you like to comment on them? Or quietness from the audience?
I think I think that's food for thought, because we have some sessions where we're going to be addressing this. Leslie, do you want to talk about this, the video assessment instrument? Basically,
I think we've got I'm watching Adrian here, who's told me that we were not to overrun because everyone had to have their coffee. Is that right, Adrian? Uncomfortable body language here, Tom.
Adrian, we can tell Adrian that we have got 4 minutes to wrap up, and that's what I'm doing now. So that's good. So this is what I'm trying to do. Trying to learn to become an MC. It's much harder than at a wedding. I've been an MC before at a wedding, but it's much scarier doing it to you guys. But anyway, so to wrap up, I think both of these talks have paved the way for further discussions on that sort of dichotomy between linearity and non-linearity, about summative versus formative, about having summative assessments for licensing and credentialing, but also making sure that we're using assessment properly so that the learners gain as much as they can out of these assessments. And I think this is exciting because actually during the next 2 days we have some excellent sessions coming up which will again cover those dichotomies. We've got a symposium this afternoon on the medical licensing assessment, which is very UK orientated, but it's definitely transferable for other countries which have got credentialing and licensing examinations. I think that's going to be really interesting to look at how we assess, how we use a summative assessment to assess standards of our graduates, but also making sure that there's a patient safety aspect to it as well. And then also tomorrow afternoon is a symposium on competency-based medical education, and within that we're going to be talking about getting away from tick box checklist-based scoring methods and actually thinking about what does competency-based medical education mean, how can we use those building blocks to make them much more meaningful assessments, and bringing in things like EPAs. So we'll have those discussions. I know Eric Helmbo is going to be doing a talk where Eric's done lots of work on EPAs through the Milestone project in the US, and it'll be really interesting to see what he's got to say. And obviously Kees van der Wiesen this evening is going to be talking again on programmatic approach to assessment too. So I think this session's been excellent. It's paved the way for further for all the other sessions as well, which is great. I've got one other announcement, and that's that there's a change to short sessions. We're welcoming Peter Dieter, who's the president of the Association for Medical Schools in Europe, AMSI, is doing a talk on basically a talk which introduces everyone to AMSI, and this is one of the talks in the thematic presentation 6 on standard setting and psychometric analysis. So just to change the programme there, and we're lucky to have Peter here, who will be able to tell us all about what AMSI is doing, which will be really useful. And I think I've got about 1 minute to let us appreciate the speakers. I think it has been a really excellent session, 2 excellent speeches and very good dialogue.